A millionaire made a bet and married a pregnant widow with 7 children. He thought it was just a game, but things didn't go as planned. Robert Wonder, the 36-year-old CEO of Wonder Capital, a powerful Wall Street investment firm, had never lost a bet. He had built his empire on calculated risks, ruthless decisions, and an unwavering belief in his superiority. Robert had everything: money, power, and influence. He controlled everything around him, and the world bent to his will. For Robert, life was like a constant chess game, and every move he made was designed to ensure victory. People were pawns, opportunities were strategies, and domination was the ultimate goal. Over the years, he had perfected this game, making deals that crushed his competitors and further built his empire. Winning was second nature to him, and others expected nothing less. That's why, on a warm Friday night in an exclusive millionaires club, surrounded by other billionaires and corporate heirs, Robert's confidence never faltered, even when his friend and rival, Frank Berkeley, smirked across the table and said, "You always play it safe, Robert. You never take a bet unless you're sure you'll win." The men around the table laughed lightheartedly, but Robert could sense the challenge in Frank's words. Frank, the heir to a shipping fortune, had always enjoyed pushing Robert's buttons. They had grown up in the same elite circles, attended the same Ivy League schools, and now stood at the top of their respective industries. "I take risks every day," Robert replied, leaning back in his chair, swirling his drink. "They're just calculated ones." "Exactly," Frank countered, his smirk widening. "You only take risks when you know you can control the outcome. You don't really gamble." Robert raised an eyebrow. "I built an empire from nothing. That wasn't gambling." Frank waved dismissively. "That was strategy. I'm talking about real risk, something unpredictable, something outside your comfort zone." The conversation had caught the attention of the others at the table, men who had inherited their wealth and thrived on displays of power and reckless spending. Robert rarely engaged in their games, but tonight Frank's tone intrigued him. "All right," Robert said. "What kind of bet are we talking about?" Frank's eyes gleamed, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "A marriage bet." A murmur of interest swept through the group. Robert chuckled. "Marriage? That's not a bet. That's a life sentence." "Exactly," Frank replied. "That's what makes it a challenge. You've had it easy, Robert. Every woman you've been with has fit perfectly into your world: models, executives, socialites. They come from the same elite circles. But what if you had to marry someone completely outside your world?" Robert's smile faltered. "Define outside my world." "No CEOs, no models, no women with money or influence," Frank explained. "Someone ordinary, who wouldn't care about your wealth." "You think there's a woman alive who wouldn't care about my wealth?" Robert scoffed. "That's what makes it a challenge," Frank grinned. There was a brief pause before another man at the table, Mark Langston, chuckled. "I've got the perfect candidate." Mark pulled out his phone, scrolled for a moment, and then showed Robert a picture. "Meet Miriam Nike." The photo showed a woman in her late 20s or early 30s standing in a grocery store parking lot, holding the hands of 2 children while several others stood nearby. She looked exhausted, her hair tied back. "She's 30, a widow, and a mother of 7, Mark explained. "She's also pregnant with her 8th child, lives in a rundown apartment in Brooklyn, and works 3 jobs just to make ends meet." The men laughed, expecting Robert to dismiss the idea, but he studied the image a moment longer. Miriam was the definition of struggle, a pregnant single mother living paycheck to paycheck. The idea seemed absurd, but Robert was thinking about the challenge. Frank leaned back and said, "If you marry her and live with her as a husband for 1 year, without bailing, you win. And in return..." Frank pulled out a sleek black folder and placed it on the table. 10% of Burke Oil. The room went silent. Burke Oil was one of the most powerful energy conglomerates in the country, and a stake in it was worth hundreds of millions. Robert had been trying to break into the oil industry for years. Robert considered the bet. This was insane. He had never met Miriam, and a year was a long time to be tied to someone he didn't know. But when had he ever turned down a challenge? "All right," Robert said, setting his glass down. "I'll do it." The men around the table cheered and laughed, already placing bets on how long he would last. But as the night wore on, Robert began to feel the weight of his decision. He didn't know Miriam or her struggles, but none of that mattered. Robert wonder never lost, and he wasn't about to start now. Miriam Nike had stopped believing in miracles a long time ago. At 30 years old, life had dealt her more hardships than she ever imagined. Once, she had dreams of a stable life, a warm home, and a loving family, but life had thrown obstacle after obstacle her way. She had been married to the love of her life, Nelson, a hardworking mechanic. Together, they had struggled but found happiness. Then, one tragic night, Nelson was killed in a car accident. He had been hit by a drunk driver, leaving Miriam a widow, 5 months pregnant, and the sole provider for their 7 children. Since Nelson's death, Miriam had done everything to keep her family afloat. She worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices in the morning, helping in a school cafeteria during the day, and stocking shelves at night. Exhaustion weighed on her constantly, but she couldn't afford to slow down. With another baby on the way, things only seemed to be getting worse. The bills kept piling up, and her landlord was becoming impatient. She had sold anything of value, but she was running out of options. So, when a sharply dressed stranger showed up at the grocery store where she worked, she barely paid him any attention. He was clearly from a different world, the kind of man who had never known hardship. When he approached her, Miriam was ready to point him to customer service. "Miriam Nike?" he asked. Her body tensed. "Who's asking?" "My name is Robert Wonder," he said. "I have a business proposition for you." Miriam almost laughed. A business proposition? What could a man like him possibly want with her? "I'm not interested," she replied, turning back to her work. "I think you'll want to hear this," he continued. "It could change your life." Something in his tone made her pause. She looked at him again, narrowing her eyes. He wasn't someone who wasted time. "What are you offering?" she asked, crossing her arms. $1 million, he replied, as if discussing a simple transaction. "If you agree to marry me." For a long moment, Miriam could only stare at him. Then she shook her head. "You're insane." "I assure you, I'm not," Robert said. "This is a legitimate offer." Miriam's mind raced. It seemed impossible. "What's the catch?" she asked. "You have to stay married for at least 1 year," he explained. "You and your children would move into my home, and you would live as my wife, both publicly and legally." Miriam's stomach twisted. "Why?" "That's not relevant," he replied. "At the end of the year, you'll walk away with the money. No strings attached." Miriam studied him, trying to find the hidden trick. Robert watched her with an unsettling level of patience, like a man who already knew the answer. "I don't even know you," she said. "You don't have to," Robert replied. "This isn't about love. It's a transaction. You need financial security, and I need a wife for a year." It was absurd, completely ridiculous, and yet Miriam found herself thinking about it. $1 million, that kind of money, could change everything. She could move out of their tiny, run-down apartment. She could get proper medical care for her pregnancy. She could finally give her children stability, a future that wasn't dictated by how many shifts she could work in a week. But it was also dangerous. Trusting a man like him went against every survival instinct she had. Robert watched her, as if sensing her hesitation. "I understand this is overwhelming," he said. "Take a day to think about it. I'll be back tomorrow for your answer." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Miriam standing there, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. That night, she lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of her bedroom. Her youngest son, Dick, curled against her side, breathing softly in his sleep. Across the room, her other children were sprawled out on the thin mattresses they shared. She thought about the rent, the groceries she couldn't afford, the exhaustion that had settled into her bones. Then she thought about a future where she wouldn't have to worry about those things. By morning, she knew her answer. When Robert returned, she was ready. "I'll do it," she said. "But let's get one thing straight. I'm not some trophy for you to parade around. I'm doing this for my kids, not for you." Robert smiled. "Understood." But as Miriam shook his hand, sealing the deal, A nagging feeling told her that she had just made the most dangerous decision of her life. The wedding was nothing more than a formality, a quick visit to City Hall, a signature on a marriage certificate, and it was done. No white dress, no flowers, no ceremony. Just a cold, legal transaction between two people from completely different worlds. Miriam had expected it to feel strange, and it did, but not in the way she had thought. There was no romantic illusion to shatter. She had never believed this was anything more than a deal. What unsettled her was the sheer detachment in Robert's demeanor. He treated the entire event like a business merger, speaking to the clerk at City Hall with the same calculated precision he probably used in board meetings. When the time came to say, "I do," his tone was flat, uninterested, as if he were signing off on a routine contract rather than committing to a year of marriage. Miriam didn't expect tenderness, but something about his complete lack of emotion left her uneasy. After it was over, he turned to her. "I'll have a car pick you and the children up tomorrow morning. Be ready by 8. That was it. No celebratory dinner, no discussion about what came next, just a simple directive before he walked away. Miriam watched him go, exhaling slowly. What had she gotten herself into? The next morning, just before 8, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of her apartment building. Miriam had spent the night making sure everything was packed, clothes, toys, the few personal belongings they owned. Her children stood around the small living room, some excited, others nervous. "Where are we going again?" asked Jackson, her 9-year-old, adjusting his worn-out backpack. "To our new home," Miriam answered. The words felt foreign on her tongue. Could she even call it that? 12-year-old Naomi eyed her skeptically. "For how long?" Miriam hesitated. "A year." Naomi frowned, but didn't press the issue. She was old enough to know that her mother wouldn't be doing this unless there was a good reason. When they stepped outside, the sight of the massive SUV waiting for them was enough to make the younger children gasp. It looked like something out of a movie. A man in a dark suit opened the door for them. "Mrs. Wonder," he said, nodding. Miriam flinched at the title. The children climbed in first, their eyes wide as they took in the luxurious leather seats and built-in screens. To them, this was like stepping into another world. As they drove through the city, Miriam held Dick on her lap, watching the streets change, the old, worn-down buildings of her neighborhood fading into sleek skyscrapers and high-end boutiques. And then, finally, they arrived. The Caradon estate was massive, a sprawling mansion set on acres of land, with pristine gardens and a driveway long enough to make the building itself seem almost distant. Miriam swallowed hard. This wasn't just wealth, this was power. As the car came to a stop, Robert was already waiting at the entrance, dressed in his usual tailored suit, his posture impeccable. Her children hesitated as they climbed out of the car, sticking close to Miriam as they took in the sight before them. Robert's gaze swept over them before settling on her. "You're late." Miriam stiffened. "By 5 minutes. Punctuality matters," he said simply. Then he turned on his heel and walked inside, expecting her to follow. Miriam clenched her jaw, but didn't argue. The moment they stepped inside, the children gasped again. The grand foyer was something out of a palace, polished marble floors, a sweeping staircase, and a chandelier that looked like it cost more than their old apartment building. A woman in a crisp uniform stepped forward. "I'm Mrs. Basil, the housekeeper. I'll be assisting you with anything you need." Miriam didn't know what to say. She had never lived in a place where there was someone hired to assist her. The children, meanwhile, had already started exploring, their awe evident, except for peril. Her 14-year-old stood at the entrance, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" Miriam asked, stepping closer to him. Peril's jaw tightened. "Are we supposed to pretend this is normal?" Miriam sighed. "No. But this is where we live now. For a year," he muttered. Before she could say anything else, Robert returned. "Your rooms are upstairs," he said. "Mrs. Basil will show you where everything is. Dinner is at 7. I expect everyone to be there." Then, just like that, he was gone again. That night, as Miriam settled into what was now her room, a space bigger than her entire apartment, she couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of wrongness. The house was too big, too cold, too quiet. She had spent so many years in cramped spaces, surrounded by the constant noise of her children. Now, in this massive house, everything felt empty. At dinner, the tension was thick. The children were still in awe of their surroundings, but there was a hesitancy to their excitement, as if they weren't sure how much of it was real. Robert sat at the head of the long dining table, barely speaking. He ate with the same precise efficiency he seemed to do everything else with. At one point, little Dick accidentally knocked over his glass of water. The sound echoed in the silent dining room. Miriam immediately reached to clean it up, but before she could, Robert had already snapped his fingers. A staff member rushed forward with a cloth, wiping up the spill as if nothing had happened. Miriam tensed. She was used to doing everything herself. The idea of someone else handling it so quickly, so mechanically, unsettled her. Across the table, Peril was watching Robert carefully, his eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a house. It was something else. And for the first time, Miriam wondered if she had just stepped into something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Through silence, he never spoke directly to Robert, nor acknowledged him beyond a glare or a scoff. If there was anyone who could ruin the carefully constructed illusion of this marriage, it was him. But Robert didn't have time for it. He stuck to his plan. He left for work early, returning late in the evening, ensuring that his interactions with Miriam and the children remained minimal. It worked for a while, but one evening everything changed. Miriam had spent the last 2 weeks trying to settle her children into their new life. She kept her expectations low, knowing that this arrangement wasn't meant to last forever. Still, there were small things she hadn't anticipated, like how difficult it would be for the younger ones to adjust to the sheer size of the house. It was too big, too quiet in a way that felt unnatural to them. Back in their old apartment, the walls had been thin, the space cramped, but at least they had always felt together. Here, her children were suddenly overwhelmed by all the empty space. They clung to each other more than usual. Then there was Peril. Her eldest had always been protective, but now he was angry. Miriam understood why. It wasn't just a change. It was an upheaval of everything they knew. On top of that, Peril had lost the small sense of control he had over their lives. Before, he had been the man of the house, but now, in this new world, he was just another kid in a stranger's home. She wished she could make him see that she had done this for them, not to hurt them, but that wasn't something she could explain in words. That night, as she tucked the younger ones into bed, she heard raised voices coming from the hallway, Robert and Peril. She closed her eyes, exhaling. This was bound to happen. She stepped out just in time to hear Robert's voice, sharp and angry. "You don't get to tell me what to do?" Robert's reply was calm but with an edge to it. "This is my house." "Yeah, well, we didn't ask to be here," Peril retorted. Miriam hurried forward. "What's going on?" Peril turned to her, his face flushed with frustration. "He's trying to tell me what I can and can't do." Miriam looked at Robert. "What happened?" "I found him in the garage," Robert replied, crossing his arms. "I wasn't stealing anything," Peril scoffed. "I didn't say you were," Robert answered, "but it's dangerous, and you have no business being there." Miriam sighed, turning to her son. "Peril, what were you doing in there?" He hesitated. That was enough of an answer. Miriam softened. "I get it. You want space, but sneaking around isn't the way to get it." Peril's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have married him." The words hit harder than she expected. Robert's expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture stiffened. Miriam exhaled. "Go to bed, Peril." He didn't argue, but as he walked away, the tension in the hallway lingered. Robert finally looked at her. "This isn't working." Miriam raised an eyebrow. "What part of it? The deal, or the fact that you now have to live with people who actually exist?" His expression darkened. "I didn't sign up to be a babysitter." Miriam gave him a hard look. "And I didn't sign up to be your charity project, but here we are." They stared at each other for a long moment before Robert exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "This was supposed to be simple," he muttered. Miriam almost laughed. "Then maybe you should have married someone without 8 kids." He didn't reply. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Miriam standing there, more exhausted than she had been in years. The next morning, Robert did something he hadn't planned on doing. He stayed home. It wasn't intentional. He had woken up as usual, dressed for work, but as he reached for his car keys, something made him pause. Maybe it was the conversation with Miriam. Maybe it was the way Peril had looked at him, like he was nothing more than another temporary problem in their lives. Whatever it was, instead of leaving, he found himself sitting in the living room, watching as the chaos of the morning unfolded. For the first time, he really saw them. Naomi helping Jackson tie his shoes, Miles and Ezra fighting over the last pancake, Dick climbing onto Miriam's lap, yawning against her shoulder. They weren't just kids, they were a family. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Robert realized he wasn't just an outsider in their home, he was an intruder in theirs. Something in his chest tightened. He didn't like it, but he also didn't look away. For the first time in his life, Robert didn't feel like he was in control. He had always believed in structure and predictability. He had built his fortune by anticipating market trends, making calculated risks, and ensuring that every decision was one that led to success. But no financial model could have prepared him for what it was like to live in a house with 8 children, nor for the way his carefully curated world had begun to unravel. Something had shifted in the past few weeks. He had begun to notice things that had once seemed irrelevant. How Dick's laughter echoed through the halls, how Naomi scrunched her nose when she was thinking, how Peril watched him with cautious skepticism whenever they were in the same room. More than that, he had begun to notice Miriam, not just as the woman he had legally married, but as a person. A mother who had spent years sacrificing every part of herself for her children. A woman who had stepped into his world, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. And now, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, surrounded by the children who had slowly but surely forced their way into his carefully constructed life, Robert realized something unsettling. This had stopped feeling like a game. He had entered this arrangement thinking it would be simple, a year-long contract, a financial transaction, but it was no longer just a bet. It was real. And that was dangerous. Because if there was one thing Robert had never prepared for, it was the possibility that he might actually care. Miriam had noticed the change in him. She wasn't sure when it had started. Maybe it was the morning she caught him in the kitchen struggling to make coffee while Dick clung to his leg, babbling about dinosaurs. Maybe it was the way he had started asking questions about the kids, small things like what subjects Naomi liked in school or which toy was Dick's favorite. Maybe it was the way he had stopped treating her like a burden and started seeing her. At first, she had assumed it was just a trick, a calculated move to make their arrangement seem more authentic. But as the days passed, she found herself questioning that assumption. She had spent so many years relying on herself, never expecting anyone to step in. But now there was someone who was stepping in, someone who, for reasons she couldn't understand, was starting to feel present. And that terrified her, because she couldn't afford to believe in something that wasn't real. Not again. Not when she had spent years learning that men like Robert Kennedy didn't just change. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. Miriam had been out running errands, picking up school supplies and groceries, when she overheard 2 women whispering in the next aisle. Normally, she wouldn't have paid attention, but then she heard Robert's name. Curious, she moved closer, just enough to catch the conversation. "Did you hear about Jesse's latest stunt?" one of the women asked, laughing. "Married some poor single mother with a litter of kids. Apparently, it's part of some ridiculous bet." Miriam's heart stopped. "What bet?" the other woman asked. The first woman scoffed. "Some challenge between him and his rich friends. They dared him to marry the most unfit woman possible. Someone completely outside his world. If he lasts a year, he gets a massive investment deal." Miriam's blood ran cold. A bet. The words echoed in her mind, colliding with every small, fragile piece of trust she had started to build. She didn't wait to hear more. Grabbing her things, she left the store, her hands trembling as she clutched the bags. Had she really been this stupid? Had she actually started to believe, just for a second, that this marriage had become something more than just a transaction? By the time she reached the house, her entire body was shaking. She stormed inside, barely registering the kids calling out to her, and found Robert in his office. He looked up, startled by the way she slammed the door behind her. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he asked, frowning. Miriam threw the grocery bag onto his desk. "Tell me the truth." His eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" She took a shaky breath. "Is this a bet?" Something flickered in his expression. It was quick, so quick that if she hadn't been watching closely, she might have missed it. But she was watching, and she saw the guilt. The confirmation. Her stomach twisted. "Oh my God." Robert exhaled, setting his pen down. "Miriam, don't." She snapped. "Don't you dare try to talk your way out of this." His jaw tightened. "It's not what you think." "No," she said, her voice shaking. "So you didn't make some disgusting wager with your rich friends about whether or not you could marry me?" Silence. Miriam let out a bitter laugh. "I should have known. I did know. She stopped, shaking her head. "You made me think." She swallowed hard. Robert stood, his face unreadable. "Miriam, listen to me." "I don't want to listen to you," she snapped. "I want to get out of this house." She turned toward the door, but before she could reach it, Robert stepped forward, blocking her path. "Move," she said. He didn't. "Let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," she said, her voice raw. "You used me. You used my kids. This whole time you've been pretending." "I wasn't pretending," he said, and he said it with such conviction that for a split second, she almost believed him. Then she remembered the conversation in the grocery store. She remembered who he was. "You don't get to do this," she whispered. "You don't get to act like you're the victim here." His expression darkened. "I'm not." She swallowed. "Then let me go." Robert hesitated, just for a second, then stepped aside. Miriam didn't look back as she walked out. That night, Robert sat alone in his office, staring at the empty space where Miriam had stood. He should have known this was coming. He had always known that if she found out the truth, there would be no fixing it. But that didn't stop the ache in his chest, because for the first time in his life, he had lost something he actually cared about. And he had no one to blame but himself. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. Robert had spent weeks adjusting to the chaos of Miriam's children filling every room, the constant noise of footsteps on the stairs, laughter echoing down the halls, and now, it was silent. The occasional arguments between siblings had always filled the house with noise. Now, without them, the silence was deafening. Robert had never imagined he would miss it, but he did. He missed the way Dick would climb onto the couch and babble about dinosaurs while Miriam tried to wrangle him into putting on his shoes. He missed Jackson and Miles fighting over the last pancake at breakfast. He missed Naomi Sharp, observing questions. He missed the hesitant moments when Peril would almost acknowledge him before shutting him out again. And he missed Miriam. That was the worst part. For weeks, he had convinced himself that the marriage was just a business transaction, that she was merely another piece in the game. He had been wrong. She had become something more, and now he had lost her. Miriam had done a lot of difficult things in her life, but walking out of Robert Caden's mansion was one of the hardest, not because she wanted to stay, but because for a brief, ridiculous moment, she had actually let herself believe. She had told herself from the beginning that this was just a deal, a means to an end. But somehow, somewhere along the way, it had started to feel real, and that was the most dangerous part. Because Robert had never changed. He had never been the man she had hoped he was. The moment she found out the truth, it shattered every fragile piece of trust she had started to build, and she couldn't afford to rebuild it. She had her children to think about, so she packed up their things and left. Robert spent the first few days after her departure trying to focus on work, but it didn't help. For the first time in his career, he couldn't concentrate. His mind kept replaying their last conversation, the look in her eyes when she realized the truth. He had seen anger before, and he had dealt with disappointment, but the hurt in her expression had been something else entirely, and it gutted him. For the first time in his life, Robert felt truly ashamed, not because he had lost, but because for once, Winning no longer mattered. He had spent years believing that power and control were the only things worth chasing, that emotions were a weakness and attachments were nothing more than liabilities. But Miriam and her children had proven him wrong. They had shown him that there was more to life than business deals and financial markets, and now they were gone because of him. For days, he debated whether or not to go after her. He knew she wouldn't want to see him, that she wouldn't believe a single word he said, and she had every right to feel that way. But that didn't mean he was going to give up. So he did the only thing he could think of. He started making things right, not with words but with actions. The first thing Robert did was return to the place where it had all started, Miriam's old neighborhood. It was the place she had struggled to survive before their marriage, the place where she had worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table for her children. For the first time, he saw it through her eyes, the cracked sidewalks, the boarded-up buildings, the families barely scraping by. He had never really understood what it meant to struggle, not until now. So he started listening. He spoke with the people who had known Miriam before she had become Mrs. Caden. He heard their stories, their struggles. Then he went further. He found out what had happened to the factory that had shut down years ago, the one Miriam had worked at before it closed, forcing her into a spiral of endless low-wage jobs. And that was when the real guilt set in. Robert had been the one responsible for that factory shutting down. It had been a business decision, just numbers on a page, a way to cut costs and increase profits. But now, standing in the middle of the empty lot where it had once stood, he saw it for what it really was, a mistake that had ruined lives. Miriam's life, her children's lives. That was when he made his decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could fix the future. Robert sold his company, not just a piece of it, but all of it. It was the biggest financial decision he had ever made, but for the first time, he didn't care about the money. He used the proceeds to establish a foundation for single mothers. He reopened the factory, not as a corporate investment, but as a community project offering jobs to the families who had been displaced by its original closure. He started funding after-school programs, invested in housing initiatives, and did it all without putting his name on it. This wasn't about him, it was about them. Miriam heard about it through others. She hadn't spoken to Robert since the night she had walked out, but the news traveled fast. At first, she thought it was a lie, a publicity stunt. But the more she heard, the more she realized it was true. Robert had changed. Not because he wanted her back, but because he had finally understood what mattered. And that was when she allowed herself to think for the first time that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth saving. 2 months after she had left, Robert knocked on her door. She hesitated before opening it. When she finally did, he was standing there, looking different, not just in his appearance. He was dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, his usual tailored suit replaced by something normal. No, the real difference was in his eyes. The arrogance was gone. The calculation was gone. What was left was something raw, something real. "I know you don't want to see me," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. Miriam folded her arms. "Then why are you here?" He exhaled. "Because I needed you to know that I meant it." She frowned. "Meant what?" "That I'm sorry," he said. "Not just for the bet. For everything." She studied him, waiting for the catch, but there wasn't one. For the first time, Robert Caden wasn't trying to negotiate. He wasn't trying to win. He was just there. And that was what made her finally say, "Come inside." They talked for hours about the past, about the future, about what it would take to rebuild what had been broken. By the end of the night, when she finally looked at him and said maybe, he knew that maybe was enough for now. Because this time, he wasn't looking for a shortcut. He was willing to earn it, no matter how long it took. Miriam didn't trust easily, not anymore, not after everything she had been through. So, even though she had let Robert inside that night, even though she had listened to what he had to say, she hadn't given him forgiveness, not yet. And he seemed to understand that. For once, he didn't try to push. He didn't try to buy his way back into her life. He just showed up. Not with gifts, not with empty promises, but with consistency. At first, it was small things. He would check in, but never force a conversation. He would ask about the kids, but never make it seem like he was expecting something in return. Slowly, he became present. The first time Robert saw the children again after the fallout, it was awkward. They had every reason to hate him. He had brought them into his home under false pretenses. He had given them a life of comfort, only for them to find out it was all a lie. But children were different from adults. They didn't hold grudges the same way, and while some of them were hesitant, especially Peril, others were simply confused. The younger ones didn't fully understand what had happened. All they knew was that Mr. Caden had disappeared, and now he was back. And the truth was, they had liked having him around. The first time he saw Dick again, the little boy stared at him for a long time before finally mumbling, "Did you bring dinosaurs?" Robert had to fight back a laugh. "No dinosaurs today," he admitted. "But maybe next time." Dick considered this, then nodded, as if it was a reasonable deal. That was the first step. The older kids were harder. Naomi was skeptical, Jackson and Miles were cautious, and Peril, Reston, was angry. The first time Robert tried to talk to him, he didn't even get a full sentence out before Peril cut him off. "We don't need you," he said coldly. Robert nodded. "I know." Peril narrowed his eyes, clearly expecting an argument. Robert didn't give him one. Instead, he said, "But that doesn't mean I don't want to be here." Peril didn't respond, but for the first time, he didn't walk away either. Miriam watched all of this unfold carefully. She had spent so much of her life being let down by people that she had learned the hard way it was easier to expect disappointment than to hope for something real. So she waited. She waited for Robert to slip up, to prove that this was just another game. But he didn't. Instead, he showed up every day, not just for her but for the kids. When Miles and Jackson needed help with their math homework, he sat down at the kitchen table with them and went through every problem patiently, in a way that surprised even himself. When Naomi asked questions, real, thoughtful questions about why he had done what he had done, he answered honestly. And when Dick fell asleep on the couch one afternoon, exhausted from playing, Robert carried him to bed without a second thought. Miriam saw all of it, and slowly, the wall she had built around herself started to crack. The moment she knew things had truly changed came unexpectedly. It was a Saturday morning. The kids were watching cartoons, the house was filled with the usual noise, and Miriam was in the kitchen making breakfast. Robert walked in, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt. "You need help?" he asked. Miriam raised an eyebrow. "Do you even know how to cook?" "Not particularly," he admitted. "But I'm a fast learner." She smirked. "We'll see about that." She handed him a whisk and turned back to the stove, expecting him to hover awkwardly or make some excuse to leave. Instead, he actually tried. And he was terrible at it. Within minutes, there was flour everywhere. When he tried to flip a pancake, it landed on the floor. The kids erupted into laughter. Miriam covered her mouth, shaking her head. Robert groaned, rubbing his forehead. "Okay, maybe this isn't my thing." Miriam, still smiling, took the spatula from him. "Stick to business, wonder." He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, she realized she didn't feel angry anymore. She didn't feel betrayed. She just felt okay. She didn't know if she could ever fully forgive him, but she did know that the man standing in front of her now wasn't the same one who had made that cruel bet all those months ago. He was better. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The weeks passed, and Robert continued showing up. Then one day, Miriam did something she hadn't expected. Miriam hadn't planned on inviting Robert to stay for dinner, but somehow she did. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. It signaled that she was willing to try again, and for Robert, that was more valuable than any business deal he'd ever made. For the first time, he wasn't chasing wealth or power. He was chasing something real, and he knew he'd do whatever it took to keep it. Miriam never thought she'd reach this point. She'd spent so long guarding herself, refusing to let Robert, or anyone, get close again. She'd convinced herself that the damage he'd done was too deep, that no amount of change could erase the betrayal she had felt when she found out the truth about their marriage. Yet, here they were. It wasn't just that Robert had proven himself to her, it was that he had done so without expecting anything in return. He showed up day after day, not because he wanted to win her back, but because he had genuinely changed. He had built something real with the kids. He spent time with them, listened to them, and cared for them in ways that had nothing to do with obligation, everything to do with choice. Miriam had seen it all. She had watched Robert stay up late helping Naomi with her science project, seen him play on the floor with Dick when the boy was too sick to go outside, and noticed how Jackson and Miles began to look up to him. She saw how Ezra came to him for advice, and how patient Robert had been with Peril. Miriam's eldest child fought him at every turn, but Robert never gave up, and slowly, even Peril started to soften. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was something she never expected. One evening, as Miriam sat on the porch watching the sunset, Robert walked out and sat beside her. They sat in silence for a while. Then Robert spoke. "I'm leaving the city," he said quietly. Miriam turned to him, frowning. "What?" "I'm selling my penthouse, getting rid of what's left of my old life." She stared at him, confused. "Why?" He shrugged. "Because it doesn't mean anything to me anymore." Miriam looked out at the horizon. "And what does?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This," Robert said, gesturing to her and the kids. "I used to think money was everything, that success was all that mattered. But I've never felt more alive than I have these past few months. With you. With the kids." Miriam's heart clenched. She wanted to believe him, and for the first time, she thought maybe she did. But she was still scared. "Robert," she began, but he shook his head. "I know I don't deserve an answer right now," he said, his voice soft. "I just wanted you to know." Miriam swallowed. He had changed, and so had she. Maybe it was time to stop running from that. The next few months passed in a blur. Robert became a permanent part of their lives, but it didn't feel forced. He was simply there, and that presence changed everything. He showed up for school events, took the kids on weekend trips, and became someone they could rely on. Eventually, Miriam found herself relying on him too. She still had her walls up, but they were lower now. She began to wonder what it would be like to let them fall completely. Then, one evening, Robert did something she hadn't expected. He proposed. Not in a grand, over-the-top way like the first time, when it had been part of a deal. This time, it was just the two of them sitting on the porch, the crickets chirping in the distance. Robert pulled a simple ring from his pocket and held it out to her. "I don't want to make another deal with you," he said quietly. "I don't want to buy my way into your life. I just want you and the kids forever." Miriam stared at the ring, her heart pounding. She should have been terrified, but for once, she wasn't. This wasn't a trick, it wasn't a lie, it was real. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in something again. She looked up at him, then slowly nodded. "Yes." Robert exhaled as though he had been holding his breath. Carefully, he slid the ring onto her finger, and for the first time in a long time, Miriam felt at home. Their wedding was nothing like the first one. This time it was surrounded by family. The kids were there, all dressed up, laughing and happy. There were no contracts, no deals, just love. And as Robert held her close that night, Miriam finally allowed herself to admit what she had been fighting for so long. She loved him, and he loved her. Not because of a bet, not out of obligation, but because, against all odds, they had built something real. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to hold on to it. A year later, Miriam sat in the hospital holding their newborn baby in her arms. Robert sat beside her, staring down at the tiny bundle with something close to awe. The kids were outside, waiting to meet their new sibling. As she looked at Robert, Miriam smiled. "We did it," she whispered. He kissed her forehead. "Yeah, we did." And as their baby let out a small cry, Robert gently ran a hand over the tiny fingers. Miriam watched him and, in that moment, she knew they weren't just a family because of circumstance. They were a family because they had chosen each other, and nothing, not a bet, not a past filled with mistakes, could ever change that.